For me, it's really now the function to close and to try and summarize what has been a very, very rich discussion, and therefore, in a way, I'm always given the thankless and rather unrealistic task of doing so. But if I were to try and put a few observations together from the conversation today, starting with Sven, I think Sven really made the point about the materiality assessment under the ESRS, really turning it more into a question of responsibility of corporates. It's not an opt-out, it's not a voluntary regime, it's a regime based on responsibility and own responsibilities for companies, which I thought was a very interesting perspective on the issue. There was a lot of talk around the importance of international consistency. We didn't touch on it explicitly because we hope to come back to that issue in a special focus session, but it remains a very important issue, and particularly in the light of the publication of the ISSB first set of climate standards, as we heard most likely on Monday. It was interesting the focus on the need for SME standards, largely because of the value chain and the feeding through of the value chain as part of the CSDDD, so the Sustainable Corporate Governance proposal, that will drive demand for SME standards, and that in many ways the timetables were seen under the CSRD, apologies, we've got two pieces of legislation under the CSRD, might be in a way too generous, and many companies might be forced to move to quicker implementation. We talked about sectoral standards, but really we spent much more time talking about transition plans, the growing importance of transition plans, companies having transition plans, focusing on CapEx, so investments, but also looking at residual risks and the speed and nature of adaptation based on national plans and on sectoral plans. We had a very interesting set of conversations around partnership between financial institutions and corporates to identify what type of information is really needed, how it should be presented, but also the partnership between the industry on the one hand, be it financial, non-financial, and supervisors and regulators on the other, to understand and have sufficient realistic expectations as to what can be done within a time frame. And Sean referred to his 4 C's. And the most important of those 4 was the C for certainty. A plea to focus more on implementation rather than a constant revision of the rules, even if that might not be in the next year or 2, but at some stage let it settle for a bit to allow people to implement. I will not forget Helena's example in comparison to Microsoft, replacing BASIC and Pascal as kind of coding mechanisms to make it a much more user-friendly to use a computer, and in the same way her expectation that the work the platform, the Commission, the ESAs and the industry are doing to develop a similar, more user-friendly application to sustainable finance. It would make the whole framework much more digestible in a number of years. So a very interesting comparison there. I think even though there's a realization that we're not yet seeing the green dividend, we're not yet really seeing significant reductions in lending costs or in investment costs arising from the whole package. I think many were saying that we're on the cusp of that actually happening, and that companies are much more moving from a compliance-based way of thinking to integrating ESG into their strategic thinking and into their governance structures, which I think is very interesting. And then finally, we of course had a very interesting discussion, very fresh, on the sustainability rating agency approach. And while there might be technical questions on some of the aspects, I think overall the perception was that the Commission has done a good effort in starting the discussions around a more credible framework, and as Dennis said, having more predictability, transparency, and understanding around methodologies makes comparability easier. Now, some of them might already exist in the market, but it might not always exist, and it might not always exist in the future, so having some form of a framework around that might be helpful. With that, It's been a real pleasure to guide you through another of our discussion rounds. I hope you enjoyed it. You can always kind of respond online or come back to us if you've got any questions on today or just in general what we're doing as Afore Consulting and Sustainability. With that, I wish you a very nice lunchtime and hopefully see you or hear you again in the future. All the best.